All right, thanks everyone for joining. This is our first vodcast with Joanne and I on Compliance Unplugged, and we're going to talk today about a topic that we both hear quite a bit about, and that topic is actually that Purview or records management in Purview it isn't capable of doing what's called case management. So before we dig into that, let's talk about first what case management is. So case management in a nutshell is the idea or concept of tying all of your content to a single case or a single artifact. So if you think of this from a perspective of, you're selling insurance or something along that line, your insurance is going to be tied to a customer. While the life of that customer is with your company, you're going to have documentation, you're going to have agreements, you're going to have forms, and your retention is actually tied to that person's artifact of them as a customer. And so, but the argument we've been hearing is that Purview isn't capable of handling that. And I know I disagree, and Joanne, I'd love to hear your concept around that. My thoughts around this here is I think that event-based retention is probably a good contender for being able to handle this. But what do you think, Joanne?
Yeah, I think probably that Microsoft Purview and Microsoft 365 all up can certainly handle it, but it is challenging, probably because we're trying to manage records that are associated to a case in place, right in the collaborative areas that people are working in. And the problem with that is the way you can implement it inside Microsoft is using, some structure to kind of organize and group content related to a case. And that's where the problem kind of enters the scene, is it's relying on some of these other things you have to have set up in your environment to manage content at a case level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with that. And what I've been finding too is that, you having to identify how are you going to tie that to something. Going back to the example I had, if you tie it to a customer, then what determines the lifetime of that customer? And do you have content that could be retained, that needs to be disposed of even while that customer is still active? So there is that concept around there. Do I think that event-based retention is going to handle it all? I don't think so. I think there's some gaps. I really do. One of the things that could be a really key gap is that, when I want to when I want to close out a case, I don't, as a record manager, I don't necessarily have to deal with every document as an individual document. Sometimes I'll say, what case is this tied to when it comes up for disposition? But Purview, one thing I can say that Purview doesn't do is it doesn't allow you to do that. You actually do a document by document retention. You have to know, why is this coming up for retention based on the label that's been assigned to. You don't have the capability of being able to saying, okay, I know this happens to go with this case is David Drever is my customer. He's no longer my customer, so we disposed of this content. So there is some gaps there to think about. But
one thing you brought up that maybe you should explain to our audience is the idea of event-based retention, and how is that a solution to help with case management inside Microsoft? Maybe connect those two.
Yeah, so
ideas.
Absolutely, that's a great point. So event-based retention is a concept. Let's actually back it up a second here. So when you're doing retention in Purview, you have four main triggers. You have when content is created, you have when content is last modified, when you actually apply a label to content, and then the final one is kind of catch-all, is the event-based retention. So think about things like fiscal year end, employee termination, contract expiry, things like that. Those are all things or events that happen during the life cycle of a document. And so how this ties back into case management is the fact that the customer no longer being part of your organization. So, I would go to, I'm a customer getting insurance from you. I'm no longer going to be your customer going to some other company. You close my customer record. And that is the event that should kick off all of that content. Is that kind of what you're talking about there, Joanne?
Yeah, it is. And then when you're kicking off that retention event, your desire is to start the retention on all of the documents potentially for that customer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that is, and that's really the tie-in right there is that, you know, and that's what the arguments I've heard is that Purview can't do case management, but really you can. It's that event-based retention tie-in. Now there are
Yeah.
some pieces that aren't there. So for instance, how does Purview know that the customer has been closed? It doesn't. So there has to be some
Right.
pieces you have to put in there. Whether you have, someone from your finance team or whoever's in charge of the case control, they change the status, and maybe you have some process that watches for that status and kicks off the event. Um, or anything else. Maybe you have a tie-in. You're using Dynamics 365, and you have a Power App workflow that is actually
Mhm.
watching for when that customer gets closed in Dynamics, and then it updates something in Purview, and that kind of ties back into some capabilities of the auto. You can do some auto closing of event-based retention. Sorry, auto events from something changing.
Right. The kind of back end automation piece is really important for this, because to do event triggers at scale, you're going to have some kind of automation in the back end from some other non-Microsoft 365 app in some cases
Yeah.
to trigger the event that starts the retention clock inside
Yeah.
Microsoft. So there, not going to lie, there's a heavy lift that comes with some of these events,
Hmm.
depending on what is the business process that triggers that event and how are you going to automate that back inside Microsoft Purview. And then what about the disposition side? What about, okay, we've triggered the event, we've got 150 documents associated to this closing customer file. How do you action the disposition if a review is required on those 150 documents?
And you're lucky if it's only 150 documents in some
Yeah,
cases, right? So
yes.
absolutely, and that kind of goes back to that point I was making earlier, is that there's nothing in Purview today that says this document, while it's attached to this label, we have no idea that's actually attached back to this case. So we don't know. So it does take some extra steps. So there is that concept around there. If you need to do a disposition review, if you don't, then you're fine. You can just let the content get disposed based on your timelines and things like that. So there are options now. Something that we can talk about, I think, as well is you could, instead of using Purview as the disposition process, is you could actually use a Power Automate custom workflow, and that custom workflow could gather all that information for you, so that you have that all at your fingertips. So while you're still using, you're still using the compliance console, and I call it compliance console because that's what the tie-in is on the Power Automate side. But you're using Purview to kick off the disposition of your content. It's actually the Power Automate flow that's actually doing it for you, and you getting all that information.
Right. One thing I'm definitely going to bring up, because it's, I think anybody kind of trying to do this at enterprise scale needs to acknowledge is, although the Power Automate flow could do that, and all of these external, triggers for the event can certainly be built. All of these things add technical debt into your organization. So make sure that you have the right IT skills, either, through a consulting company or in-house to build these things and keep them maintained over time. That's really, I think, an important part of the operational aspect of deploying retention controls across Microsoft 365. This is one part of that whole operational picture. What are your thoughts on
Absolutely.
that?
Oh, absolutely. Like it's that every time you want to add some complexity, and let's be honest, case management is a complex concept.
Yeah.
You're going to have that technical debt that you're talking about. You're going to have some way that's going to handle it. Let's be honest. Like, Microsoft has made huge inroads into records management over the last 5 years or more. But there's still gaps there. So those gaps need to be filled by some customization of some sort. And that's where you need. So to your point, you need to be able to ask the questions: what do I know? What don't I know? Can we do
Hmm.
this? How do we get that information? You know, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Dave and Joanne's Compliance Unplugged podcast might be a good place to go to. You know,
Right. Yeah.
But it's that sort of thing. So being understanding what you need to do to execute on what you want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also say some case management uh, models or requirements are easier to implement than others. And I'm going to call out fiscal year end as an
Yes.
example. Very common retention trigger. And the case in that example is all of the content relating to that fiscal year across all of the sites that you
Mm-hmm.
have, which can be a lot of content. Very common model I see. That one is quite easy to implement. First of all, it's only one event trigger a year typically,
Yeah.
unless you're going fiscal quarter. So that part is relatively easy, and you just have to ensure you've got a fiscal year tagged on all of your content, which there is some reliance on some kind of structure across your environment to be able to do some of these things. So just making sure you have those dependencies in place is important. And yeah, it's an example, in my opinion, of fairly easy case management and event-based retention to implement that covers off a good number of your retention labels in your schedule.
Absolutely, because you really only need to, you may have a few labels that are all kicking off based on that, but you really only need
Yeah.
to, and that's the great thing about one thing we didn't mention about event-based retention is that you actually are able to group them under what are called event types. And so
Yes.
that event type can be all of these different types of content. You fire it off once and it goes and finds
Yeah.
all those labels for you.
That's right.
Another common example is actually employee termination or employees leaving the organization.
Yeah.
And what's great about that one is it's a little bit more complex, more dynamic. You have people coming and going all the time, but you can also tie that into your HR system. To
Yeah.
give an example, Power Automate has a Workday connector, so you can actually tie into Workday, and when an employee is marked as being terminated, you can actually go in and kick off all the a flow that then will begin the event trigger for all of your employee documents, and you pass in the date when they're terminated and things like that, and everything goes off based on that. So there's lots of options available to you, but it all boils down to is I think that this concept, and this is my opinion, but I think that the concept of case management is handled in Purview. It just maybe some gaps that we all have to deal with, but I think it is handleable in Microsoft Purview. I don't final thoughts there, Joanne?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not, going to say it's an easy lift. You still have to bring
Mhm.
your SharePoint um, admins into the design kind of session to figure out how you're going to implement some of this stuff, and how are you going to trigger some of those events for the case management from a developer perhaps. But that's kind of consistent across implementing, in my opinion, implementing retention all up across the board. You need to have skills brought in from many different teams, and this is one of those examples that definitely you need different resources and skills across the organization to implement it effectively.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks very much for joining us today. We're gonna have some links in the description of the video here today. As a matter of fact, a shameless plug to everyone. I actually just finished releasing a blog on this, so I have some more information in there, and I also have links to mine and Joanne's blog site as well. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you hit that subscribe button and keep up with us as we continue on this journey. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.